human rights situation in Saudi Arabia remains very alarming. Although it's encouraging that the Saudi government released human rights activist Lujin al-Hathlul, she still remains in legal jeopardy, and many hundreds of people still remain imprisoned unjustly. For example, Sheikh Salman al-Auda, prominent Saudi cleric, who in fact represents a more progressive attitude towards Islam in many ways than the Saudi establishment itself. And so it's quite alarming that the Saudi government is making claims to be promoting so-called moderate Islam, when in fact one of their premier clerics who has pushed for sort of a rethinking of certain assumptions around conservative interpretations of Islam has been in jail and suffering for lack of medical care in solitary confinement since fall of 2017. So in general, the human rights situation in Saudi Arabia is atrocious. Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, has made many mistakes, although I think his instincts are correct in that he has tried to shift Saudi society or made efforts around reaching greater levels of employment for Saudi youth, and this is part of why he retains the support of young people who have seen more opportunities for them under his rule. In general, on foreign policy in particular, he has made numerous blunders, everything from the Yemen war to obviously the atrocious, brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi, to kidnapping the Prime Minister of Lebanon. And he has yet to demonstrate that he has learned better, in particular given that he continues to fight the war on Yemen. I think it's possible that maybe he has started to learn, and moving forward that hopefully he would focus less on sort of wreaking havoc in the region and instead prioritize Saudi Arabia's resources on providing better for his population. But it's not yet clear that he has learned, unfortunately. He has not succeeded in closing the file on Jamal Khashoggi. The Biden administration has announced that they will be releasing the information related to that. It remains at the forefront of the minds of many Americans when they think about Saudi Arabia. In addition to Saudi Arabia's role in 9/11, the fact that the majority of the 9/11 hijackers were Saudi, for many Americans, Saudi Arabia continues to be seen as a sponsor of terrorism and brutality. And so moving forward, it would behoove Mohammed bin Salman to actually address some of these issues, not merely to indulge in sort of superficial reforms. Something like allowing women to drive is an admirable first step, but the guardianship system remains in place. Women continue to be abused under this system, and moving forward, much more fundamental changes need to be made to Saudi society. And I know that changes have been made, and these are commendable, and they should continue. But most importantly, Mohammed bin Salman needs to stop repressing and imprisoning his own people, as well as killing people outside of his borders. I think it's important to keep in mind that the predecessor of King Salman, King Abdullah, was actually much more responsible for this in terms of efforts to open up certain assumptions around Saudi Islam, to allow, for example, the dialogues that he instituted to start to allow for greater discussion within Saudi society of some of these issues. Obviously, the effects of the King Abdullah Scholarship Program have been instrumental by sending hundreds of thousands of young Saudis abroad. This has contributed to this change that is observable on the ground, especially in urban Saudi Arabia, less so in rural areas, but especially in city centers like Riyadh, obviously Jeddah, Dammam, that there is a shift. And so in terms of Saudi, the young Saudi generation being interested in moving away from some of the norms and conservatism that characterized their parents' and grandparents' generations. And so I think Mohammed bin Salman has been able to benefit from a lot of those efforts that King Abdullah undertook and to sort of claim them as his own. And then under, as I said, his somewhat superficial initiatives, things like opening cinemas, which I remember speaking with people in Saudi Arabia who were concerned that the perception abroad would be that, you know, these Saudis were just desperate for cinema all this time, when really, you know, Saudi people are like any population in the world. They want opportunity, they want employment, they want a safe and stable environment for their children, and, you know, cinema is really not at the top of their concerns. And so, you know, for many Saudis, the real thing they would want would be more economic opportunity, and from, at least from my perspective, that to spend less resources on things like the war in Yemen, for example, which is taking a huge amount of Saudi resources and would be much more effectively spent on the Saudi population. Very similar to the United States, that the U.S. continues to spend vast amounts of resources on the already enormous and bloated American military budget, instead of investing in the many priorities at home in terms of the American healthcare system, American education, etc. So I think both the Saudi government and the U.S. government need to reassess their priorities there and really invest in their own population. He has consolidated power in around himself. He's really shifted. Historically, the power within Saudi Arabia was shared among many different brothers, different sons of King Abdulaziz, the founder of Saudi Arabia, and so certain brothers would have more control in certain areas of certain aspects of the government or the economy. And as a result, policymaking in Saudi Arabia was often much more circumspect, much more cautious, received the input of multiple powerful princes who helped to, which in some ways perhaps some might argue this led to sort of a lack of change or lack of initiative on Saudi's part, but we can see that the alternative is also not necessarily good, in that when we had Mohammed bin Salman consolidating power in himself, he's been able to undertake decisions that are not necessarily in Saudi Arabia's best interest, nor the region's. Again, the war in Yemen being the clearest example of that perhaps if Mohammed bin Salman had less power, Saudi Arabia outcomes might have been different in that case. But I do think having accumulated this power around himself, it is likely that he will become king, and moving forward, the United States needs to get used to that and to be ready to work with him and to hopefully encourage his more productive impulses, those like supporting the development of his own population, the Saudi economy, diversifying away from petroleum. Vision 2030, for example, is admirable in its objectives, but unclear how exactly that is going to be implemented, given the ongoing low price of oil and MBS's tendency to try to invest in big vanity projects like NEOM instead of emphasizing the needs of his citizens. Under Trump, the only human rights violations that the Trump administration wanted to talk about were coming out of Iran, for example, in the region. Almost nothing about the violations by Saudi Arabia, by Egypt, by Israel against Palestinians. And so now the Biden administration has said that human rights is going to be central to their foreign policy. The Biden administration has clearly, as I mentioned earlier, it seems that message is perhaps being read, at least in Riyadh. Riyadh releasing both Loujain al-Hathloul as well as the two dual nationals, American Saudi nationals, recently, although again all of them remain in legal jeopardy, although they have been released. On the other hand, President Sisi of Egypt recently imprisoned the family members of human rights activist Mohammed Sultan, who is based here in DC. ironically, the same day that was announced, the U.S. announced that it was going to sell more weapons to Egypt, as is sort of customary. This was not new or unexpected, but again, just reiterating the extent to which, on the one hand, the U.S. criticizes human rights violations, and yet, with the other hand, is selling weapons and offering military support to these dictatorships. And so I think the Biden administration will very quickly lose any credibility they may have if they continue to advance weapons sales to support these regimes on the one hand, while making noise about human rights on the other hand. Unfortunately, Islamophobia remains a huge problem. There's insufficient accurate and good information about Islam in the West. In my opinion, it would be very useful for American students, for example, to learn about all religions academically, to study the history of Islam, of Judaism, of Christianity, of Buddhism, of all world religions, in order to have a better understanding of what these religions are and what they are not. That historically, especially after 9/11, Americans had very little understanding of Islam, and unfortunately, U.S. policy helped to contribute, both in the United States and abroad, to this notion that the U.S. was sort of fighting Islam, or that Al-Qaeda sort of stood for Islam, which was exactly what Al-Qaeda and other terrorists like ISIS, like Daesh, have wanted. They benefit from that narrative that it's a fight of them against the U.S., which means it's a fight of Islam against Christianity or against the West. And that the U.S. should have been much more cautious to emphasize that efforts against terrorists and other actors bent on committing acts of violence are in no way seen as, that these actors are not seen as representing Islam, that this is not about going after Islam, and the U.S. should have been much more careful about not targeting Muslim Americans or Muslims in the United States, sort of profiling them based on their name or just their appearance. These kinds of policies were really horrific, and again contributed to the goals of terrorist organizations who benefit from this framing within which the United States is targeting all Muslims and all of Islam. The results and effects of the global war on terror, unfortunately, have been it's had the opposite of its intended effect. Terrorism is more widespread now than it was 20 years ago. Like I said, the extent to which the United States has contributed to a narrative within which the U.S. is seen as, or sort of acts in such a way that allows actors like Al-Qaeda or ISIS to portray it as going against all Islam, is deeply problematic. So the good news is, I think that Americans are very sick of fighting wars in the Middle East. They're sick of military intervention in general. They understand that as the United States continues to pour a huge portion of our discretionary budget into war fighting, that this results in the neglect of actual priorities that Americans are interested in. And this has been nowhere more apparent than during this past year under the pandemic conditions of COVID, that despite the United States spending more on its military than the next, I believe it's 10 countries combined, America has been unable to protect Americans from COVID. Hundreds of thousands of Americans are dead. And so moving forward, the Americans, my hope is that Americans will demand that their representatives stop pouring so much money into the national security establishment, the Pentagon, etc., and instead focus on actual priorities for Americans. Again, healthcare system, education, and most importantly, climate change, that this is something the entire world is already dealing with. And moving forward, the United States needs to act towards other countries in a way that facilitates cooperation, because climate change is not something that the U.S. can address by itself. And so moving forward, It is imperative that the United States build bridges, work on diplomacy, reduce conflict, stop spending on the military to such an inordinate amount, because climate change is really the real threat that our children will ask us why we didn't do more about.